Alright, Wicked Streets TV fam, what's good? Salute to everybody tuning in, rocking with the channel. If you've been here for a minute, you already know how we do it over here. And if you're new to Wicked Streets TV, welcome to the spot where we break down the real stories from the streets. The kingpins, the investigations, the crime sagas, and the dark history behind it all. Today we're stepping into another gritty story coming out of Baltimore, where the streets and the opioid crisis collided in a way that had law enforcement scrambling and whole communities feeling the fallout. This one involves a young dealer, a stash house packed with heroin, hundreds of thousands in cash, and an investigation that eventually pulled the federal government into the mix. But like a lot of these stories, it ain't just about one man. It's about the bigger picture. The pipeline moving drugs from the city out into surrounding counties. The overdoses piling up. And the task force is trying to chase the supply back to whoever they believe was sitting higher up the ladder. So lock in, because this one gets dark. It gets complicated. And it shows you how the streets and the system collide in ways most people never really see. This is Wicked Streets TV. By the fall of 2017, the streets around Baltimore was already cooking like a pressure cooker left on high. And the law was out there hunting for whoever they thought was feeding the dope pipeline. That's when the name Karon Elijah Peoples started ringing bells inside them task force offices. Young dude from Baltimore, only about 23 at the time, but investigators swore he was moving real weight. Heroin getting pushed out to people all over Maryland who were making that ride into the city like it was a late night food run. You know how that goes. Suburban cats driving into the city quiet, grab their poison, then disappear back to their quiet neighborhoods like nothing happened. The Harford County Narcotics Task Force had their eyes locked on them heavy, and they wasn't working alone either. They had the whole alphabet soup behind them. Local cops, state police, federal people, all circling like vultures, waiting for the right moment to drop. They started building the case the way they always do when they think they got somebody big. Undercover buys, confidential snitches whispering in ears, controlled purchases, unmarked cars parked half a block away pretending to be invisible. The whole quiet movie setup. According to them, Peoples wasn't just some corner hustler flipping little bags. Nah, they believed he was pumping serious heroin through the pipeline. The kind of supply that had people from Harford County, Baltimore County, Carroll County, even the Eastern Shore showing up in the city looking to score. And with the way the opioid wave was smashing communities at the time, every overdose suddenly turned into a breadcrumb the police tried to follow back to whoever they thought was the source. People's name kept popping up in those overdose conversations too. Non-fatal ones, but still enough to make investigators think they had the right target in their sights. Some reports even had them whispering that fentanyl might have been part of the mix, which, if you know anything about that era, meant things were getting real dangerous real fast. They believed he was working out of two spots in Baltimore, and both of them sounded like classic city setups. One was a high-rise over on West Lexington Street in West Baltimore, one of those buildings where traffic moves in and out all day and nobody asks too many questions because minding your own business is part of survival. The other was a townhouse out on Frankford Avenue, across from Moravia Park Primary School, which honestly just adds another layer of that grim irony the streets always seem to produce. Kids learning multiplication tables across the street, while grown folks are running the kind of business that ruins whole families. December 7th rolls around, and that's when the plea gets called. Somewhere in Baltimore City, officers make the move and pull Peoples over. Now, anybody who grew up around this kind of stuff knows a vehicle stop can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it's a regular traffic stop. Sometimes it's 10 unmarked cars suddenly boxing you in like the end of a chase scene. Either way, That day, the investigation finally steps out of the shadows. They take him into custody right there in the city, and when they search the vehicle, and depending on who tells the story, maybe even his pockets too, they say they pull up somewhere around 68 to 70 grams of heroin. Not a brick, but definitely not pocket lint either. Enough to make the task force feel like all those weeks of sitting in parked cars and listening to informants whisper paid off. And just like that, the quiet investigation that had been creeping through Baltimore for weeks finally had its headline moment. Because once the cuffs click, that's when the real storm usually starts. So boom, the same day they grab Peoples, the police ain't waste no time playing around. Once the cuffs clicked, they started running through those search warrants like a crew kicking in doors after a long night of surveillance. They pulled up to that Frankford Avenue spot first, and then swung over to the other location on West Lexington Street, which investigators were already whispering about like it was some kind of stash hub. Now you know how that goes in cities like Baltimore, New York. Everybody got a regular crib, and then there's that other place where the real business sleeps at night. The Lexington Street spot was the one they really had their eyes on. And when they went inside, that's when things started looking like a scene straight out of one of those federal drug documentaries. Inside that place, they allegedly pulled up almost a full brick of heroin, about 900 grams, give or take, which on the street was supposed to be worth somewhere around 110 bands. Now that kind of weight ain't some corner boy hustle. That's the type of stash that tells investigators they might be looking at somebody moving serious product through the pipeline. But the drugs weren't even the wildest part. What really made everybody's eyebrows jump was the cash. And not a little stack either. We talking over 400 bands, somewhere between $405,000 and $405,156, depending on which report you read. The money was allegedly packed away inside Louis Vuitton bags. Some accounts said it was one blue checkered Louis joint, others said 2 designer bags stuffed with bundles of bills. Either way, imagine walking into a room and seeing that kind of bread sitting there like somebody just finished counting the lottery winnings. That's the type of discovery that makes detectives start looking at each other like, yeah, this ain't no small-time operation. And the place supposedly had all the usual pieces you'd expect when the dope game is running like a business instead of a hustle. Digital scales sitting around, a money counter ready to chew through stacks of cash, wrappers for kilogram bricks, the kind of little details that prosecutors later like to line up in court and say, see, this wasn't personal use. It was the full inventory of a distribution setup. On top of that, they pulled out a Rolex watch too. And depending on who you ask, there might have been 2 expensive watches in the mix. One of them was said to be worth more than 70 bands, and the other over 20. When you start adding numbers like that together, you realize we're not just talking about drugs anymore. We're talking about a lifestyle. Flashy watches, designer bags, piles of money. The kind of shine that turns heads whether you're on the block or sitting behind a desk at the police station. They even seized a 2017 Honda Accord, which might not sound glamorous compared to a Rolex, but cops love grabbing cars because vehicles are like moving evidence lockers in cases like this. After all that went down on December 7th, Peoples got booked in Baltimore City, but the case wasn't staying local for long. Nah, the detectives from the Harford County Narcotics Task Force knew what they had and started moving the paperwork upstairs. Once the feds start sniffing around the case, the whole temperature changes. Investigators took the file to the U.S. Attorney's office, laid everything on the table: the surveillance, the buys, the stash house, the cash, and the overdose connections they believe were tied back to the supply. Federal prosecutors looked at it and basically said, yeah, this one's big enough for us to grab. When the feds adopt a case, that's like the game going from street ball to the NBA overnight. The stakes get heavier, the sentences get longer, and suddenly, the courtroom ain't in the neighborhood anymore. So on January 4th, 2018, the hammer officially dropped. A federal indictment came down in U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, charging Peoples with possession with intent to distribute heroin. 5 days later, January 9th, they scooped him up again under that federal warrant. This time, it wasn't just local detectives in the mix. It was the federal system stepping in. And once a judge looked at the case, Peoples was held without bond. That's the moment where the walls really start closing in. Because once you're sitting in federal custody waiting on a drug case like that, time starts moving real slow. Officials held a press announcement up in Bel Air, Maryland, talking about the whole situation like it was one of the biggest heroin and cash seizures tied to a Baltimore dealer in that region. Captain Lee Dunbar from the Harford County Narcotics Task Force got up there and basically painted Peoples as a major supplier pushing a dangerous drug into their county. He said the nearly kilo of heroin and the mountain of cash they seized would disrupt the operation and hopefully save lives. That's the official version they always give when the cameras come out. The idea that every big bust is one step toward cleaning up the streets. Dunbar also made it clear the task force wasn't planning on slowing down, saying they were going to keep chasing dealers no matter where they lived. And he pointed straight at Baltimore City as the pipeline feeding heroin and fentanyl into Harford County and the surrounding areas. Now, whether you're hearing that from the law side or from people who grew up watching these cases play out, one thing's always certain. When that much money, that much product, and that many agencies get involved, the story stops being just another street case. It turns into a full-blown storm. And once the feds step in, that storm usually don't pass quick. Now, while all this was unfolding, the bigger picture around Maryland was looking like something straight out of a war zone, except the enemy wasn't bullets. It was that opioid wave that had been drowning towns all over the state. Harford County especially was getting hit like somebody left the faucet running and forgot how to turn it off. Detectives and first responders were talking about overdoses like they were responding to house fires every other hour. Ambulances flying around, cops pulling up to scenes where somebody's laid out on the floor, families crying, Narcan getting sprayed like it was cologne. After a few years of seeing that kind of thing over and over, you could hear it in their voices. They were burned out, worn thin. Even the toughest street cops start feeling that weight when every week somebody else is dropping from the same poison. And then fentanyl started creeping deeper into the mix, along with car fentanyl, which is the kind of stuff that makes heroin look like child's play. Those synthetic opioids were so strong, investigators said even a tiny bit could knock somebody out cold, sometimes just from touching it or breathing it in wrong. To the picture. They believed he was sitting somewhere in that middle to upper tier of the chain, the kind of supplier that multiple smaller dealers might be pulling from. Maryland had already built up these big and tied to him. Now, anybody who knows the game knows a stack of phones like that usually means business lines, backup numbers, maybe burners, maybe customer contacts, maybe everything mixed together like a messy phone book of the street economy. Once investigators got a court order to dig through them, they started pulling out hundreds of text messages, conversations going back and forth between Peoples, another person prosecutors said was working with him, and a whole list of customers. Messages setting up purchases, arranging meetups, the type of talk that prosecutors love because it reads like a transaction log written in street slang. According to them, those messages helped show that the operation wasn't something that popped up overnight. They said it went back at least to May of 2015 and kept running until the day he got arrested in January 2018. But the part that really made the case hit heavy was what happened when investigators started connecting those phones to overdose calls. They ran the numbers tied to those 49 devices through their databases and came back with links to 27 overdose victims spread across Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. 27 people who had either texted or called one of those phones before they ended up collapsing somewhere. Out of those 27, 9 didn't make it. The other 18 survived. Prosecutors said those victims had reached out to people's numbers before overdosing, arranging heroin buys through calls or texts like it was just another routine transaction. That's the kind of evidence that turns a drug case into something much darker in court. Because now, the story ain't just about possession or distribution anymore. It starts brushing up against lives lost. And when investigators laid it out like that, it painted a grim picture of how the streets and the suburbs were tied together in that era. People driving into Baltimore looking for something to numb whatever pain they were carrying. Dealers supplying what the market demanded. Cops trying to follow the trail backward from hospital beds and crime scenes to whoever they believed was feeding the supply. A vicious circle, spinning non-stop. And by the time all those phone records, overdose reports, and surveillance notes got stacked into one case file, the authorities were convinced they had a map of how that pipeline was running. And they believed Karon Peoples' name was written all over it. So by the time the summer of 2018 rolled around, the whole situation had already been dragged into the federal spotlight. And the story that started with quiet surveillance and stash houses was now sitting in a courtroom under fluorescent lights. July 18th, 2018, Peoples, just 24 years old at that point, steps up in federal court and decides to take the plea. Now you gotta understand something about the federal system, bro. Once you're in that building, the game ain't the same as street court no more. The feds move slow. They build cases like accountants. And by the time they offer a plea deal, they usually got a mountain of paperwork sitting behind it. So Peoples admits to being part of a heroin distribution conspiracy. And in the agreement, he basically acknowledges that during that run, he was responsible for moving somewhere between 9 and 10 bricks of heroin. That's not little corner money. That's serious weight over time. And part of the deal included him acknowledging something even heavier, that the phones tied to him had been contacted by those overdose victims before they collapsed. The same 27 people investigators had been talking about. 9 who didn't make it, and 28 who survived. According to prosecutors, those people had reached out through calls or texts to arrange buys before everything went sideways. That's the kind of detail the government loves, because it turns a drug case into something that sounds way darker in front of a judge and a jury. Now, once that plea was locked in, the numbers on the table got real serious. The conspiracy charge alone carried a mandatory minimum of 10 years and could have stretched all the way up to life if the court really wanted to swing the hammer. Then there was the possession with intent to distribute charge, which had its own set of numbers. Minimum 5 years, maximum 40. Basically the type of menu where nothing on it is light. Sentencing got set for October 16th, 2018. And everybody knew that day would decide how long Peoples would be disappearing behind federal walls. So October comes around, and the courtroom scene plays out like it usually does in federal cases. Prosecutors lay everything back out on the table like they're reminding everybody how the whole story unfolded. The stash house raid, the heroin they said they pulled out, around 1 kilo, sitting there like evidence of a pipeline. The cash, over 400 bands and drug proceeds stacked up like somebody tried to hide a small fortune in designer bags. The 49 cell phones that investigators said were being used to run the business side of the operation. All those details come back up because the government wants the judge to see the whole picture one more time before the sentence drops. Then Judge Richard D. Bennett makes the call. 10 years in federal prison. After that, 5 years of supervised release when he gets out. In federal court, that means real time too. No parole, no early walkout like in some state cases. When the feds say 10, they pretty much mean you're sitting down for a long stretch of that number. Then the U.S. attorney at the time, Robert K. Hur, gets up and says what prosecutors always say in cases like this. He calls heroin dealers merchants of death, says they're selling despair, reminds everybody that heroin had become one of the leading causes of death in Maryland during that era. And he throws in that reminder about the federal system that always hits like a cold slap. If you get convicted here, there's no parole waiting down the road. You do the time, period. From the investigation all the way to the sentencing, the authorities kept telling the same story about Peoples, that he wasn't just some random street hustler, but a significant dealer whose reach stretched outside Baltimore into places like Harford County and other parts of Maryland. To them, his arrest was just one battle in a bigger war they said they were fighting against the opioid epidemic swallowing whole communities. They pointed at that nearly $500,000 in seized money like it was a dent in the machine, even though everyone involved knew it wasn't going to shut the pipeline down completely. Because that's the thing about the drug game, fam. All right, Wicked Streets TV fam, that's where we gotta wrap this chapter up. Now, when you really sit back and look at this whole story, you start seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes. This wasn't just about one arrest or one stash house getting hit. Nah, this was part of a much bigger picture. The streets feeding the suburbs, the addiction crisis spreading like wildfire, task forces chasing suppliers up the ladder, and whole communities getting caught in the middle of it all. Cases like this show you how complicated the game really is. Money, power, desperation, survival, all tangled together in one ugly cycle. And trust me, Wicked Streets TV ain't stopping here. We're gonna keep breaking down stories like this from city to city, state to state, the kingpins, the street legends, the investigations, the corruption, and the real-life crime sagas that most people only hear pieces of. Because these streets got history, and a lot of it never gets told the right way. So if you rocked with this episode, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I always want to hear what the Wicked Streets family thinks about these stories. And stay locked in, because there's always another wild story coming up next. Wicked Streets TV, we out.
This shit is wicked in these mean streets, mean streets.